Perfect.
Okay. Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Berg Weiberg and I'm here today with my co-host Anne-Christine Bertrand for the first Conversational Technologies talk from the Lucerne School of Design, Film and Art. And in these talks, we invite artists, designers and scholars to help us understand how generative AI is changing creative practices and how the current developments relate to the ongoing entanglement of humans and machines. Some housekeeping remarks. We are recording this event, as you've probably seen, so please keep your mics muted. We will begin with a presentation, then Anne-Christine and I will start the discussion, and finally we will open up for your questions and ideas. So this series of talks is organized by our Creativity and Digitality Hub in partnership with different degree programs. The Creativity and Digitality Hub is a recently established initiative to promote research into and with new technologies in the arts. And this very first talk is being jointly organized by the Hub and our Camera Arts Bachelor program, which is, I would say, at the forefront of contemporary image practices. And I'm happy to hand the virtual microphone over to Anne-Christine to tell us a little bit more about camera arts and to introduce our guest, Linda Dounia Rebeiz.
Yeah, thank you very much, Birk, and a warm welcome to everybody, and especially to you, Linda Dounia. We are very happy to have you with us this evening. As Birk was already saying, and some of you, of course, know as you are students of camera arts, we are a photography program, but more in an expanded sense, like including, of course, all contemporary image practices and also AI, of course. That's why we are very happy and excited to be part of this talk tonight and to organize this together with Birk. We work a lot in new documentary strategies and storytelling. I would say now we present you, Linda. I will keep it short so that we then have space for your lecture. Linda Dounia, you are an artist, designer, and writer, interested in the philosophical and environmental implications of techno-capitalism. And you are living in Dakar, you are Senegalese-Libanese, and your work mediates your memories as alternative realities and evidence of excluded ways of being and doing. It is formed through the dialogue and tensions between lived experience, code, and AI. You are an advocate for greater agency over algorithms, how we perceive them and are perceived by them. And I think this is a very interesting part that we will most likely hear more about when you talk about your project Once Upon a Garden, which is one of your most recent projects, a long-term project, right? That you started in 21 and which went up until this year, 24. But before telling too much, I would say I will hand over the microphone to you, Linda. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the introduction and thank you for having me. So let me put this up. Yeah, so I guess the title of this talk is What is Worth Remembering? It's a question that is central to my practice and also has been a guiding light in terms of how I interact with AI and how I position myself with using it, despite a lot of the complication that comes with that. And just to briefly introduce myself, I produce a lot of stuff. So as an artist, as a designer, as a writer, I'm constantly asking questions about who I am and where I'm from and how, like, what's the position of that in the world? How does that interact with the rest of the world? And because I started my career in design, I became aware very quickly of having a different experience with technology than intended by the creators of said technology. the way it included people like me, the way it reached my geography, the way we interacted with devices and interfaces. Everything felt a little different, but yet somehow undocumented or I guess, unexplored. And so I wanted to explore that in my practice. And so to go back to the question of what is remembering, it's really the central question of my work in building AI models. I'm curious about what's missing, what's not there. And that's what most of my practice is trying to find, things that we can't find anymore. Yeah. I guess every artist has to answer this question for themselves. What is an image? And it is a question that is very potentially every time there's a new technology capable of producing images, it's a question that becomes relevant again. What is indeed an image? What does it do? What does it mean to produce an image? And I think it has had various meanings over the generations, from cave paintings to paintings and illustrations to photography. But what I'm interested in more beyond the technical definition of an image, which also changes, because if you're creating an image with a digital tool, you're assorting pixels, or you're denoising an image, as opposed to sort of creating it from scratch, so to speak. But I guess what I'm more interested in, it's more of what's behind the image that gives it meaning. Because increasingly with AI, we are sort of accepting the idea that all images are data points, and all those data points are in the service of training, no matter how they're acquired. And so I'm really curious always about what's behind it, what gives an image meaning. And there's a couple of things that really, I guess, tickle my fancy, is the idea of an image always concealing a context, an imaginary, and a set of values. So when we think about images that I produce them based on what I've grown up thinking is beautiful, what I've been told by my surroundings is beautiful. That context plays a lot in my choice of colors, in my choice of subject, in my choice of composition. And then there's the idea of the imaginary, how we project who we are into the world, the mythologies, the ideas that make us also come through in the images we create. And then finally, kind of the set of values. What's important to us? What do we want to show? What feels top of mind that deserves to be talked about or seen or processed in some way? And all of that is still relevant when we talk about AI, despite the fact that the image isn't produced by a person. It is trained. AI is always trained with us, with our knowledge, right? With our production. And therefore, it is never value neutral. It's always betraying an imaginary. It's always set in a specific context. And the best way to kind of illustrate that is to look into AI biases. Until very recently, for example, something a lot of artists decried is this pretty bias. All AI images seem to just feature beautiful models. A certain idea of beauty, again, which is where these three ideas, context, imaginary, and values, come up. And based on how AI is trained, that is the data sets, but also who's doing the training. There's a lot of human input still in how we build these gigantic models, right? And their influence affects how we produce information and how we produce images. And I think that is a very new problem, or a very new concern that artists have to reckon with, is that when you're creating with AI, you are always inevitably creating with the creators of the AI, the people who are gathering the data sets, the people who are training the data sets. That means their context, their imaginaries, and their values. And so you are constantly collaborating or negotiating your own context, imaginary, and values with those of the technicians creating these models. And I think that's a very interesting sort of thing to grapple with as an artist making images with AI. And what's context, what's imaginary, what's values, and what do images represent? And I think, again, this is agnostic of how you produce the image. One of these things will be present, whether that's your experience, a particular relation, bodies, environments, feelings when you're dealing with more abstract ideas, time. But the interesting thing here to note is that we all have different conceptions of what this means and what this looks like. Based on where I'm from, I have very specific ideas that guide how I perceive time, for example. And that may not always be possible to get when I prompt a model or when I build a model and retrain a model. Because those more abstract ideas, the way we do things, tend to sort of get lost in the noise of the web. When you consider all of the images that are available for training on the web today, the truth is that over 90% of it is produced by less than 4% of the world's population. And so you can imagine that there are a lot of perceptions of these various ideas and these various constructs that are completely missing from the data sets because not everyone's perspective is currently being represented. It's very obvious when you talk about things like race or when you talk about things like ageism with AI, but I think it goes beyond that as well. It's about how we think about the world. If only 4% of us are responsible for how much data is available to train AI, I think we are constantly in a place of lacking, in a place of misrepresentation for the majority of the world, not just specific races or specific age groups or sexual orientations. Everyone, I think, is currently being misrepresented by AI based on what it's trained on. So for me, working with AI, I've come around to this idea that the images that I'm producing have to be produced with the rigor of making an archive, because of all of these ideas that give them meaning, right? If I prompt an image on Midjourney or DALL-E, I'm getting an image that is not just a set of data points. To me, it is always information about what's important to the people training this model, what data was available to them, what data wasn't available to them, and where I find myself with regards to the image. So what's my position with regard to the image? And so my practice is archival with AI. That's what I like to say. Whether I'm speculating on archives, whether I'm actually archiving with real data, I'm constantly in this mindset of making sure images are always seen as records, are always labeled correctly. Yeah. And to me, doing this is kind of a resistance in a way. Because if you think about, again, the statistic that 4% of the world population is generating over 90% of the data on the internet, When you think about where I'm from, when you think about digital penetration, when you think about access to technologies like AI, which are considered to be cutting edge in some places like where I'm from, working with AI in this way feels like a resistance against erasure. Because increasingly, I find that my world is missing from technology. It was always the case, but now, because I'm able to produce images with said technology, I have evidence that that's the case. And I think that that's very, very important. I'm very sorry. My daughter just barged into the room. Give me a second. Sorry about that. Having children. um, yeah. So to me, again, these are proofs. These are the images that I produce are actual proofs of whether my world is being included or not. So the central, I guess, question when I say what is worth remembering is really kind of saying it in a different way. If intelligence is how we remember the world, if it is the best archive, the most complete archive of the world we have today, then what is missing? When we say the word intelligence, artificial intelligence today, I think what we mean is always very different. There's various models, and LLM works differently than a GAN works differently than a diffusion model. And now we're moving more towards generalized models. But I think really, when you think about image production, when you say artificial intelligence, you really mean a data set, a particular data set with the context, the imaginary, and the values that it reflects. And again, the world is this amalgam of various things that we like to channel when we make images. So when we ask what's missing, we're really questioning. We want to open up the data set and interrogate, what are the bodies that are present? What perceptions of time? What length of time is it encompassing? How many different ranges of emotions is it able to channel? What types of relations, whether they be power relations or other relations that it does it show? What type of imaginaries and experiences are reflected by this data set? So I like to think of AI as a time machine. That's the word that I use. It's To me, it feels like an ethical way of approaching it, because at any given time, I am constantly in touch with the data that's behind, right? To me, it's a time machine. I can go back in time in terms of what's behind this training, right? Like, what are the actual images that are used to produce the images that I end up producing? And so if we consider that it is probably better at prediction of things that already existed rather than things that might exist based on the way the data set is put together, then I think it's actually a really good instrument to remember, and to interrogate how well we can remember specific things. If we wanted, let's say today the only capsule we had of the Earth or some kind of message we were sending to outer space was AI, and an alien wanted to interrogate what does a city in the world looks like, and they asked New York, you would probably see with a lot of fidelity New York over the past few years, right? Going back hundreds and hundreds of years based on the number of users in New York that are documenting the city. Versus if you interrogated it for my city, Dakar, you would find a lot of holes. You would find a lot of inaccuracies, a lot of predictions that are probably not based on actual reality because there's not a lot of data. And so I use it to remember, but I also use it to interrogate how well I can remember something. And based on that, determine what's missing? What are areas that need a lot more work? in order to feel represented. So I wanted to give an example of a project in this speculative archiving practice, which is called Once Upon a Garden. And in this, again, this archive, what's missing is more interesting than what's present. And it's about making things we can't see visible. So it starts with this very simple question of which flowers did my grandmother grow up with that I can't see because we've experienced about 60% loss of biodiversity in the last and 50% in the last 60 years. And so it starts with that question, and then it tries to create a data set based on the flowers that are still in existence, as well as the flowers that have already disappeared. And in certain places in the world, you can probably answer this question more accurately than for my geography. But this is a problem I've actually noticed is a problem for everyone, not just West Africa. So while my data set focuses on West Africa, the reality is that we haven't done a very good job at documenting with images the loss of biodiversity. For the most part, we know the species. We sometimes have accurate names for species and good rating on the endangered scale. But the efforts of documenting these as they're disappearing faster and faster isn't measuring up to how fast they're disappearing. And so I thought this was an interesting question to show what's missing in a lot of AI models today. So the process really starts with an actual archive. So what do we have? What's the best archive we have of these extinct and endangered flora species from the West Africa region? And there's a couple of ways to get that. The first one is herbariums, which are these like dried flowers on pages. And they can be found in botanical archives. I think one of the biggest one is the Kew Royal Botanical Archives based out of the UK. And so these are flowers that were documented during colonial expeditions dating back to the 1800s. And it's usually flowers for which we don't have an actual image or even a drawing, right? So that's one way I was able to get information on to answer my question. And then the other way was using scraping data based on the species that I was interested in from the internet, but also going out and taking actual pictures of flowers that was around me. So one of the things that I've noticed is that obviously I couldn't find a lot of flowers in my surroundings. So of all the endangered species that I was interested in, I probably found about 8 myself in nature. And this is a list of 115, right? So there's about 8 that I was able to find myself over the span of a few years. And I was able to photograph. There were a couple more that I was able to get on the internet just by doing some research. I ran into a lot of problems with labeling, for example. So I would need to use machine vision, for example, to label it properly, because sometimes you take a photo, but you're not necessarily labeling it by the scientific annotation for the flower. So you kind of have to do a lot of reverse labeling here. But for the most part, there were no photographic evidence of these flowers ever existing. We only had a name, maybe a herbarium page, and some annotations from a botanist, and nothing else, not an image, nothing real that we can look at and remember what it might have looked like. So this led into training a GAN with all the images I was able to gather during this research, and then using that GAN as a basis to evolve how we could see. Essentially, as computer vision got better, the flowers I was trying to remember also got more defined, more photorealistic. So if you see here the first image, from 2021 and 2022 from the GAN, it's more of a suggestion of a flower. It's a general shape of a flower, but not quite a flower. And then I'm able, with the first diffusion models come out, I'm able to use both text and image. So I'm able to use the GAN image and annotations from the actual botanist or the actual recordings of this flower to imagine it better. And over the span of 2 years, it's the actually just between 2022 and 2023, the leap was insane. Like if you look at the leap between 2021 and 2022 from a GAN to a first diffusion model, it's sort of, it's okay. It's good. It's not that great. Definitely doesn't look like a flower from the GAN. Starts to look a little bit like a flower from the first diffusion model. But by 2023, it's insane what we're able to achieve in terms of photorealism. It's a little bit scary, actually. It felt irresponsible of me because I was thinking about, do we deserve to see flowers that have gone extinct by our doing, by our activities? Is that a responsible thing to represent as an artist because it was that good? And then it's getting more and more realistic. But as it gets more realistic, I also found an interesting new bias, which is that I think we were able to achieve photorealism in a pretty faithful way in 2023. But between 2023 and 2024, I think engineers got really interested. And this is, again, the people building these models. They became very interested in making it almost larger than life, more beautiful than life, with less imperfection and more almost plasticky perfection. I think for them, if I were an engineer working with AI, what I'm interested in is I can make this look so good, it's even better than reality. But for an artist, I'm not interested in that, right? I actually reject that. I want the imperfection that nature often provides. And so you see the flowers tend towards a more synthetic aesthetic, which I found very curious. And so I decided to keep exploring it as well and lean into it as well. So this is one of the first outputs created with this project. And when I say spectral remains, when I talk about sort of these models giving at best a suggestion of a flower, this is really what it means. Your eye wants to, like your brain kind of wants to think it's a flower, but it really isn't. It's a denoising process that has gone to its absolute sort of like edge. This is the best it can do with the training data it has. It's poetic in a way. I think it's potentially my favorite stage of this project, I would say. And and then it sort of keeps evolving. So this is a view of like an individual flower moving. And this is I think at this point, we're at the third chapter, and it's getting so photorealistic that I felt, again, it was irresponsible to actually show the flowers in the form that it was being shown, because it looked like an image too much. And so I wanted to add these dots that and their role was just to obfuscate some of the detail of the image, just to remember that this is a memory, this is a speculation, this is not a real archive, and we don't deserve to actually see the flowers in this photorealistic way. And then I sort of started going into this idea of, is it possible to rewild this archive? Can I take multiple genuses, multiple species together using collage as a way to sort of make it wilder? Because the outputs were, again, photorealistic, but always an individual flower at the time. And I was interested in sort of, it felt clinical, and I wanted to work with it in a more, again, to rewild this technology. And the collages sort of became a big focus of mine for a while. And I think it opened up a new area in my practice, which is that I think of AI, images produced with AI, as material as opposed to an end, as a beginning of something. It's always in service of a larger, more involved sort of manipulation. It's the beginning. It's kind of as you're gathering material to create an art piece, the images generated by AI are also at the level of material as opposed to production, like an actual produced work. And this is the final chapter. You see the jump from almost organic and like very felt, and to me more photorealistic than what we have now, which is very plastic, synthetic aesthetic. And when I do these, I'm not prompting for aesthetic. I will say I always go with the default model bias, so to speak, because it is also a sort of mapping of how AI technology has evolved. And I think I wanted to have a faithful account of that as well. And one of the interesting things now is that it is possible to take these images and turn them into videos. So if you see the difference between the first video and this one, if you see the first video that I showed at the beginning of this project and at the end of the project, the difference is that the first video is frame interpolation. So I'm getting a bunch of images in succession, and they're sort of like morphing into each other. So that's possible with again. Now with the newer models, like if you're exploring Sora or Gen 3, you're not doing that. You're actually creating an animation, not just from a frame interpolation. It's actually generating a multiplicity of images itself, and then creating the video you're seeing now. So yeah, that's a little bit about my practice, my project. I really wanted to keep it short so we can talk. You can ask me questions and we can have more of a discussion.
Thanks a lot. I'm just thinking maybe we can start with better understanding the journey that you went through. I mean, you described this journey, I mean, you call it chapters, I think, as a technical journey where the image is becoming more and more realistic. And the other thing is that I was interested in, can you a little bit tell more about the different tools, what happens? Because, I mean, maybe it's not clear for everybody in the beginning with GANs, you're using images as an input, then with diffusion models, you're using basically text, you're using different tools. So what kind of decisions did you make there? Can you a little bit talk about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Matt and Holly Herndon, but I think the real production here was the making of this data set for this project. I think that's the most important aspect of the project, is the actual curation of all the data points that went into training the GAN. And the data points were both images and text, right? So at first I couldn't use the text because I can't really use a text with GANs. The best I can do is annotate the images I'm training with, right? And weigh them differently. So a GAN is basically so it's called generative adversarial network, and it's basically two algorithms fighting each other. And that's how they learn. So you have a discriminator and a generator. And so a generator is essentially using the data that's been inputted into the model and creating new images based on that. And the discriminator is looking at the images that are produced and the images that were in the training and saying how close they are, right? So it gives you a score of how close the produced images are from the training images. The more images you have, the better. So to train a GAN well, you need anywhere between, I think, at least like 5,000 images, and that over 10,000 is always best. So that's kind of where this project started. So the production of the database itself, I think, is part of the artwork, right? It's like, I think potentially the most important performance or the most important step in production for this artwork. And then afterwards, when you start using diffusion model, there's a bit of a loss of agency here, because with a diffusion model, you can only use two things. You can use text and an image, right? So you can use an image as an aesthetic reference. So using a style transfer for the image to look closer to what the model is going to produce. And then you can use text as prompt to guide it, right? So I was able to do that starting from this like second chapter in 2022. And then that's basically what I kept doing with different models every time. So at first in 2022, there was the first model ever, diffusion model accessible at the time was DALL-E. And then it became Stable Diffusion, and then it became Midjourney V6. And then it ended up with Gen 3, which is a video making model. So the process is the same, the model is just slightly different, and the way it's, I guess, generating images different. But what remains after the GAN, which was the more involved step, is that I always have an image as style reference and a text, which is the botanical annotation for that flower, in order to create the image, or to recreate the image in this case.
Yeah, I find it especially interesting that you said you gave up agency. I mean, you also earlier told that you're not working against the model, you're working with the model. You're not trying to create an own style anymore. So basically, you're no longer, one could say that you're no longer portraying the plants, you're portraying the model, or?
Yeah, in a way, I think it's a performance of models here. At first, it was about the plants, but I think it quickly became a very good metaphor for how these models are currently operating and what kind of images they're able to produce. In other projects, I have more agency, especially when I'm training my own model. I always feel like I have more agency. But in this one, I wanted to show both what it means to have agency in a process like this, the quality of image you're able to get versus the quality of image you're able to get if you just kind of relinquish control to the model. And it's okay to do here. I don't think it's okay to do always. I think it's okay to do here because it's, again, an archival process. I am trying to find out how good AI is at remembering something that doesn't exist. And so my aesthetic preferences, I think, have to take a back seat here.
I find that very interesting, because one thing that was convincing to us was that you were starting really kind of analyzing, like a researcher, step by step, these tools, not only in this series. This is the long-term series, the most kind of like consistent one that you did, and where you really, over a longer time, you were really researching exactly what you were just explaining. But you do it since very long time already. And I'm interested, like you mentioned a little bit, like what is more important for you, the process behind or the final artwork that comes out in the end? And how would you describe all this long path that you already did? And do you see yourself as artist or researcher here, doing a real analysis? Where would you position yourself, and how would you perceive process and final artwork, the importance?
That's a really good question. I remember when I first presented this project, someone from the audience asked me, okay, you've explained this to me like, I don't know, you were some kind of like scientist or technician, but where's the poetry? And I remember thinking, oh, I've never asked myself that question. That's a really good question. I think I really took a investigative approach to this project. I was really trying to answer the question as faithfully as I could, with an accurate representation of what each stage of model was able to do. And so I think often I'm not in the artwork at all. And even in the way this collection was later acquired, every collector received an archival, essentially like bundle of a species. So you get a species and you get all the images from like the first chapter all the way to the fifth chapter. And that's the artwork. So it was interesting to me that the artwork looked in the end when it exchanged hands. So when I was transferring it from my hands to the hands of a collector, it became almost a small data set, right? So
Yeah.
I think in this particular project, the making of a data set in service of creating these like smaller data sets, what is the most important part? The actual images themselves are, again, it's like browsing through an archive. You're looking at evidence of something. You're looking at proofs of something. You're not necessarily in a sense that a traditional artwork or traditional photograph channels something, a kind of feeling or a place in time. I think it doesn't do that as well. It's like it's a combination of all these of 5 images for each species. That is the message as opposed to each individual image.
Yeah. And how important is then, like, because if I remember well, like from you have like these 5 chapters, right? In
Yeah.
this, and every chapter if I remember well, has a different outcome in the end, right?
Yeah.
Like some are on canvas, some are a video on a screen. Like how important and how do you decide which kind of outcome or image carrier in a way, you finally then use for each chapter? How are
That's
the
a good
processes?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the images you have here are like what's produced by each chapter. That's exactly what it looks like. This format, this image, this is it. Every single chapter is always one single flower, one image, and then it's just like thousands of them, right? Um, Once I did that, again, I can't help it. I'm an artist. I'm looking at these images. I'm like, what can I do with this? Just for me personally. Um, so I would try different things. This is where kind of these artworks start to come into play, like the video or this is a video, but I wasn't able, it was too big to load here because it has some kind of it has a live code feature. But so this, for example, I took the images that I had and then I overlaid some code representing the amount of land mass we've essentially deforested in order to grow crops, like staple crops.
Mhm.
And so this is now me as an artist bringing myself, using these images as material to then make a commentary, right? At this point, I'm no longer saying, oh, look at how these models have evolved. Look at how good we are at remembering things now. I'm actually kind of processing that information in a way that speaks more about my context, my imaginary, my values.
Mhm.
Here, the choice of putting the dots to obfuscate some of the image um, almost became like my way of feeling better about the work, because it felt too good, too real to be presented, and almost like an absolution. It absolved us of, it's okay if the flowers disappeared, we can still see images of them. Um, I felt that was wrong. So again, this is me imposing my context, values, imaginary. With the collage, same thing. I've always loved collage. I think AI material, if you consider AI images produced with AI as material, you have a really like a large amount of material you can work with. And so there's about 15 or so of these large scale collages. They're actually huge. Um, I think the biggest one is on a 4 meter by 8 meter wall, because I can just produce, and in a very automated way, I can just produce images and collage them automatically using code. and you can fill a massive space. So I thought that was like a really fun thing to work on. And this is where I start to blend in some of this is again more aesthetic choices are starting to show. I'm choosing the flowers I'm including in these collages. I'm choosing the color of the dots. I'm not choosing the placement of the dots because that's done by an algorithm. So for this work, for example, it's collage based on an algorithm made in P5. P5 is a JavaScript language. And so I load up the images into the algorithm, I write the algorithm, and then I can create just many, like ad infinitum images like these. But there's a lot of more aesthetic kind of choice because I actually wrote the algorithm myself versus when I'm training, I'm not actually writing the AI algorithm myself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Can I come back to the question of that you are making your collections or small archives if you're doing series? Because I mean, what you mentioned before is that there is, of course, we are all aware of that this collected data sets that are used, they are not representative and these things, that we know, which is in a way you can say it's nothing new. I mean, art collections are not representative, I don't know, archives and these, so it's basically nothing new in itself. And it's of course we have to criticize that, but it's always much more easy to criticize it than to say that how should an ideal data set look like, So the question is there something like an ideal data set, or would your answer be that we have different data sets or individual data sets or collections, or how would you see that?
Yeah. I am one of the I really believe the stage we are in AI, where AI is still small and very specific models do very specific things with very specific data sets, is the best thing for us. I think it's the best thing for AI. We are obviously tech companies want to move towards more generalized model, like a model that, I don't know, can tell you what's wrong with your dog, also make a painting. Like, I don't find that incredibly interesting because then what's happening is that you get more and more data and you're leaning more towards an averaging effect. So it's not doing anything specifically very well. Versus very specific small data sets to the scale of like one human being, right? Like to the scale of one artist. Like I, for instance, over the past couple of years have made maybe 5 or 6 different data sets. And it's an incredible achievement to me because you kind of do that anyway when you're making art, like whether you're doing it passively or you're doing it in a more active gathering of like images or you're gathering influence, you're constantly sort of nesting these data sets as you're creating artwork. And there's a way now that this has meaning in the context of AI. And so being able to do it in a more almost, again, scientific research focused way was very fulfilling. And I think that's where I find AI to be the most attractive, interesting, poetic, even, is when I can see that my individuality, my voice can be channeled through the data set, right? And that would be like if an artist were to do this project, exactly this project, following all the steps that I followed, I guarantee that the results will be very different based on their starting point, which is how they collected the data set, how they crafted this data set.
And this also as a way of diversifying the training data sets and the outcomes. And as far as I understood, it's also for you a kind of creating a form of resistance, that your art becomes a kind of resistance again, like using the tool in a way that it becomes a very individual tool and more kind of diversifying the data existing, filling kind of gaps, but at the same time also keeping this kind of control over it in a way. And I was interested, but sorry, Birk, this is again going away from the technique. But I was very interested because you were saying in one of your talks that you don't really see yourself as an activist, but as an artist. In the same time, I was wondering about like where what is the power of being the artist versus being an activist? Or where do you position yourself? Because somehow for me, this artwork becomes an activist part as well, in a way. Like, how would you describe it, what your power as an artist and the creativity you use to use this AI tool serves you as a positioning point?
That's a really interesting question. I think I'm not brave enough to be an activist, or articulate or well researched. I think being an activist is an incredibly like selfless and brave act, right? I'm good at making art, I think. That's like the thing that I'm good at. And I hide behind my art sometimes to say the things that I believe, because if I'm, presenting this project and I'm talking about this project, I'm not talking about race. I'm not talking about things that this project talks about, but I'm using flowers. I'm hiding behind flowers to make some of these ideas universal, like so people can feel these ideas. I'm not saying, I think there's many, many different ways to achieve a common goal, right? And my specific approach is um, to use metaphors, because that's a privilege I have as an artist. I can use poetry to make a point. I can use images instead of writing an essay, or making a speech. I take that as a privilege. I think I'm in a incredibly privileged position to be able to do this and to be listened, right? Like, it's not a guarantee that people would listen, right? Um, and in that way, I don't think it's extremely brave. I think it's more, how would I phrase this? I think it's doing something different. That's It's sort of using allegory and metaphor and channeling the things that I care about because they affect me, but in a way that also is healing to me, and potentially someone else can learn from that. Um, but I wouldn't wear the hat of the activist because I don't think what I do is brave enough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What I think, because I was really interested into this power that you have as an artist, because what I think is powerful here is that it comes along as something quite innocent in the first glance when you don't know anything about the work, but the deeper you dig, the deeper you understand the political sense, you understand how you really go into the tools and really scientifically investigate in using them, and at the same time really dealing with very important questions that come along with this tool, but not addressing them directly or with a finger like this, but in a way that is more indirect, but even more powerful in that way. So I was interested how you see the power or the possibilities you have as an artist working with AI in a context that is highly political, ethically difficult, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Mm.
I think there's like a couple of ways to approach AI. You can go into it just like with your blinders on and ignore just how complicated this technology is. Complicated is a euphemism. It's downright like bad in many cases. Like, it's downright unethical. The way data is collected to train, like issues of privacy, issues of authorship. There's so many real questions at the that underpin this technology. And then if you dig even deeper, who's making this technology? Why? Like, who's interested in making this technology, and why are they making it the way they're making it? How has it become, in the span of a couple of years, like a super commercial endeavor when it was largely academic before? There's a lot of questions about tech that AI surfaces. A lot about who's making our tech and why are they making it. Because the usages of AI in the context of art, we talk about it a lot. A lot of the backlash against AI is against artists using AI, right? We bear the brunt of like the outrage, but AI is used in war. Like AI is used in screening um applications when you apply for a job, and it's the biases are so real and they have such a crazy impact on people's lives there. But this is a gateway. We can all start to understand how these things work, and we can all start to ask these questions. And it's a very, and I think art always has been that, right?
Mm-hmm.
You use the medium of poetry and the medium of art to sort of like start to think about the same problems you have, just in a different way, in a way that
Exactly.
connects with you, or in a way that breaks down very complicated topics into things you can understand, things you can see, things you can interrogate because you can see them. And I think there's like a tremendous power in that. Like as an artist going into AI, accepting all the issues, but not accepting, actually acknowledging all the issues and going in with the intent to surface them through the work is, I think, a very important thing to do today, because no one's going to read AI papers, right? Like they're complicated, they're difficult to like understand. The average person, including myself, have a hard time understanding what they really mean. But an artwork travels. Um, Someone who's 5 and someone who's 70 can probably have a similar understanding of how these tools work just by looking at flowers, which I think
Mm-hmm.
is again a very privileged, fun thing to be able to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are slowly running out of time. We promised in the beginning to open up, so I would say
Oh yeah.
that this is still the chance for the students to ask their question.
I stop sharing here.
Mm-hmm.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. First, so I would have two questions. Maybe the first would be I wrote down at some point you mentioned you don't see your work, or at some point it was too realistic, and you thought you kind of made some interventions in the images, and then I was kind of a question popped up in my head, and I wrote down like if or why you would not consider your work kind of somehow being an archive of our time, even though it is made with IA, but it's kind of representing the time we somehow live in and the tools that we use. So you could also maybe in some way consider it also being some kind of a archive of, yeah, of our time, kind of.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And I think that when I, not just my work, when I look at other AI artists using AI, I don't like the term AI artist. I think
Mhm.
that's it's not real. Other artists using AI that I like, the work that I always gravitate towards is has this element of like nostalgia for the world. Like it's using like nostalgia as a tool to kind of talk about where we are today. Either it's like a longing or a grieving or of like uh past aesthetics or specific places. Like a lot of AI artists will use like VHS, for example, like aesthetic. And there's like a lot of things like that that are happening that are showing me that we are trying to talk about today, but using the past as a critique, like as a method of critique. And I think that's a really interesting, this idea of sadaj, like, or nostalgia being a way to sort of critique where we are now, um, is something that I think it's like, there's a lot of poetry there that I think is really interesting.
Thank you very much. And the second question, which I kind of or was wondering, like at some point you started to move on from still images to moving images, and I was wondering why maybe you made that choice, or where you maybe also see the difference, or if you even see a difference for yourself in the
Yeah,
still moving images.
I really like making videos. I think it's just like I watch a lot of TV, so I grew up like watching a lot of TV, and to me, image making like there's a place for it, and there's also always a place for like an image, like a video, something interactive. To me, videos are interactive. So it wasn't like a specific moment where like, oh, this could be a video. It's more like I always try to make something animated anyway. Like whatever I'm doing, like I could be working on a completely different project and I'm like, oh, what does this look like out of this video? And I try it. It's like it's almost like my scrapbook, like the thing that I do when I'm not doing anything. So it wasn't necessarily like a specific choice. It was just something I always make.
Okay, thank you very much.
Of course.
Further questions? Profit of this moment.
I can also ask maybe another question. So, maybe where do you see yourself going in the future? Like, do you plan to continue the project, or is there something else that you kind of or yeah, what is the plan kind of with the project? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know if I want to keep going with this project. Maybe I will. Like, I see that I don't expect the models to get that like way better than they are now, unless something surprises me and I want to re-explore it for sure. But I feel like we've kind of reached a plateau with like how the models are creating images. In fact, now it's more about correcting their issues, right? Than making them like more powerful or making them a slightly like less energy consuming, things like that. But I'm interested in doing something similar, which is what I've been working on in the past couple of years. Now it's been like 2 years on cities and urban landscapes as like the places we grew up make us. I really believe that could be, and the reason for that is because my hometown, the way where I grew up is it looks completely different. It's almost as if someone took down the entire neighborhood and built something new. And so I don't know if the same for some people, but sometimes you go back to your hometown when you're like in like having a tough time and you just walk around and you see yourself as a kid again and you try to reconnect with who you are. I can't do that anymore. And I thought that was interesting. There was something interesting that there to create virtual like hometowns from the past, like if only to recreate my hometown. I've been using yeah, I've been looking at more like AI as sort of world building, specifically like recreating these memories that I have of my hometown and my city.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Thanks for asking.
So I think if nobody else has question, then maybe I would finish up with a question that, I mean, we are an art school. What would you recommend for art schools right now, how to teach students this stuff? Or how you think education should change?
That's a good question. I think I've heard about this like idea of teaching like technology for image making and teaching it as like a value neutral thing. I think that definitely needs to change. It's impossible to teach these sort of technologies without acknowledging how they're made and by whom. I think that's like a very interesting ground for critique by art students, to look at technology not in a vacuum, just to actually position it in the value chain, right? From like the minerals that are used to create the hardware that we use to the actual like cables under the ocean that we call the cloud. There's actual cables that people have to lay there, to the devices that we have, like the ecosystems, like I think tech within the ecosystems that it's a part of is an infinitely more interesting subject than just the tech. Like I'm less interested in, for example, if I was in school today learning AI, I'd be less interested in like how to write a prompt. because that you could just pick up on YouTube, right? You can tinker and figure it out. I'd be more interested in how to subvert prompt. Like, what does a prompt mean, right? Like, why do we have to prompt? Is there another way to like create an image using AI? Who decided that it had to be prompt? Who decided that it had to be mostly done in English? How do I weigh things differently? Can I give feedback to a model? I think there's so many interesting questions when you start to consider the technology outside of its like apolitical vacuum, and you actually really situate it in politics and ecology. I think it's infinitely more interesting to learn about it from that standpoint and to tinker with those complications and hopefully break it. I think we should learn how to break these tools and technologies in school.
Okay, thanks. It's a lot of interesting questions. So I see we have a lot of things to work on. So thanks again for this talk. I would just quickly plug in. You have an upcoming talk with the Mozilla Foundations in a few weeks. I just put if somebody wants to follow up and hear you talk about other projects you're doing,
Thank you.
then everybody's invited to follow up there. And Christine, do you have any last words?
No, thank you as well from my side. I thought it was really interesting, and especially also what you said about teaching in the end is something that I take very serious as a head of program. And I think it's really understanding these techniques not as techniques or tools only, but more as a kind of also culture that you have to learn in a way that come along with all these aspects that you were just mentioning. So I think this is very interesting, and I will definitely follow up in your next talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Have a
Yeah,
nice evening.
thanks to everyone. Thanks for being here, and then a very nice evening to everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.